In this mini lecture, we're going to be discussing writing a literature review. And let me start by saying that writing a lit review is one of the more difficult skills that you'll have to master as a researcher. I often find that students find this assignment to be very frustrating because they feel that they're not very good at it. But just understand this really takes years to master the skill and become proficient. So be patient and be gentle with yourself as you learn the process. To review your assignment, you're going to be discussing the use of classical or operant conditioning for behavior management or the treatment of some psychological disorder. This could be something like using aversion therapy for smoking cessation. It could be something like using a reward system or a token economy for the management of disruptive behavior in the classroom. You do have to have your topics approved by me before you start writing, but you're very free to research an area that is interesting to you. You will need to include at least 5 peer-reviewed articles in your review. It can certainly be more than that. These need to be scholarly articles. So these are the types of articles you would find through your TSU Journal database, possibly Google Scholar, but these shouldn't be layman type of publications. The articles you use must have been published within the past 20 years, and your paper should be at least 5 pages in length, not counting your title page, your abstract, and your references. So the body of the paper needs to be 5 pages in length. And you will need to use APA formatting, 7th edition. Now, this is how your grade will be determined for the paper. I won't read this to you. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to look over this, but just know that your paper is worth a total of 200 points, and this is how those points are distributed. So what is a literature review? A lit review is when you take a large amount of research on a certain topic and organize it in a meaningful way. And the key term here is meaningful. You're not just summarizing articles. You're finding connections or patterns among the articles. You're making sense of the research for the reader. So I think about this in terms of if someone were to ask you, what is this show about? What is The Office about? What is the show Friends about? You wouldn't describe each episode. You wouldn't say the first episode says this, the second episode is about this. So in the same way that you wouldn't describe a show by talking about each individual episode, you want to describe this area of research by finding patterns and connections between the articles rather than just talking about each article in isolation. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later in the lecture. So the first thing you'll have to discuss in your lit review is relevance. Why is this topic important? Why should it be studied? I like to think of this in terms of if you were applying for a grant and you were asking somebody to fund your research, why should they give you their money? Why should they invest in research on this topic? You can discuss things like impact on society. How does this disorder or this behavior impact society as a whole? How does it impact the people dealing with that disorder of the behavior? How does it impact the people around them? So why is it important that we do research on this area? Why is it relevant? Next, you'll talk about your article inclusion criteria. And I think this is a concept that students tend to struggle the most with. You want to define your criteria and include all articles that fit that criteria. So even though there's a 5 article minimum, once you define your area or your criteria, you have to include all articles that fit that criteria, even if it's more than 5. So for example, if you say that your topic is the use of aversion therapy for smoking cessation, you would have to include all articles that fit that criteria. Let's say that that is 100 articles, you would need to discuss all 100 articles. And again, remember that the parameter is written within the past 20 years. So let's say there are 100 articles that have been written about smoking cessation within the past 20 years. You would have to discuss all of those articles. You wouldn't want to pick and choose. You couldn't choose 5 articles out of that pool of 100 articles to discuss, because that would not be a true review of smoking cessation and using aversion therapy over the past 20 years. If you choose a topic area and you realize that it's too broad, it includes too many articles, you can then shrink your topic area. So you want to shrink your criteria. So for example, you might say, I'm not going to just discuss aversion therapy in general for smoking cessation. I'm going to discuss the use of aversion therapy for smoking cessation with just teenagers. So then you've narrowed your topic area, and you'll want to include all published articles within the past 20 years within that topic area. Let's say it's still too broad. Let's say you have, within that pool, you have 30 articles, and you want to make it even more narrow. You can say, I'm going to cover all articles that deal with aversion therapy for smoking cessation with teenagers using only e-cigarettes. So anything that has to do with aversion therapy, smoking cessation, teenagers, and deals with traditional cigarettes, you don't have to cover those articles. We'll just cover the articles that deal with e-cigarette use among teenagers and using aversion therapy to treat that. So again, you want to include all articles that fall within your criteria. You don't want to hand pick certain articles from the pool of articles in that area. And again, your topic should not be too narrow. If it's too narrow, you want to have your 5 articles. But if it's too broad, then you've committed yourself to discussing all of the articles within that area. So after you read all the articles, you want to identify any trends and themes that you see between the articles. These could be things like differences in effectiveness. So maybe after reading your 10 articles, you realize that there is a big difference in the effectiveness of aversion therapy for smoking between people who use e-cigarettes and people who smoke traditional cigarettes. So that will be a pattern you see in the literature. You can see things like differences in how key terms are defined. So going back to the lit review on using a reward system for dealing with disruptive behavior in the classroom. Let's say you see that some articles are calling it disruptive behavior, but what they're really talking about is more aggressive behaviors. So they're talking about things like throwing objects, hitting peers, getting into fights, pushing, shoving, pinching. But then other articles are also saying they're referring to disruptive behavior, but they're talking about more behaviors like speaking without raising your hand in the classroom, or being out of your seat, or not being in your assigned area. So really, even though both sets of articles are talking about disruptive behavior, they're defining disruptive behavior in 2 totally different ways. Are there differences in the methods that are used? Let's say some of the studies on disruptive behavior are using teacher reports of disruptive behavior. And other studies are using researcher observations. So where the researcher is actually sitting, observing the class, and counting disruptive behaviors. So there are differences in the methods that are being used to measure this behavior. Or what about changes over time? What about maybe 20 years ago in 2000, aversion therapy seemed to be effective for smoking cessation, but over time, as the research gets more recent, it seems to be less effective. So again, read all your articles, see what patterns, contradictions, themes emerge after you've read all of your articles. So once you've identified your theme, then you're going to discuss the articles, discuss the studies, but you're going to discuss them in such a way that it supports your theme. So if your theme was that aversion therapy is effective with traditional cigarettes, but not with e-cigarettes, you'll begin by stating that thesis. And then you'll discuss all the articles that found aversion therapy to be effective with traditional cigarettes. And then you'll move on and say, but in contrast, studies that used aversion therapy with e-cigarettes found the therapy to be much less effective. And then you'll discuss those articles. So again, you're using how you discuss the articles to support whatever theme that you identified. After you have discussed all of the articles, then you will critique the body of literature on this particular topic. What does it all mean? So you want to state the current state of the topic. What do we know now after all the research that's been done on this topic over the past 20 years? What do we know now? Where does it stand now? Currently, the use of aversion therapy seems to be ineffective to treat smokers who use e-cigarettes. So where do things stand now? Then you want to discuss the strengths of the body of literature. What did the researchers do well? They could have used very diverse samples. Maybe they included people from all regions of the nation, people of all ages. It's a very diverse sample in terms of race or ethnicity. Maybe a strength is that they did 5 years of follow-up with the people after their therapy to treat their smoking. And so they didn't just look at short-term behavior change, they looked at long-term behavior change. So what did they do well? Then you want to discuss any weaknesses or gaps in the literature. Let's say that you, again, researched aversion therapy for smoking cessation, but none of the studies involve teenagers. You say that teenagers are a group who typically is more likely to smoke e-cigarettes than traditional cigarettes, and it's a gap in the literature or a weakness that none of these studies included teenagers in their sample. And then you want to discuss implications. What do we do with this information now that we have it? Should it influence our theories? Does it contradict or support some theory of behavior? How should it influence policy? So how should laws be made in reaction to this, this research? How should policies and institutions be affected by this research? And how should practice be influenced? How should the way we treat clients be influenced by this research? And next, we want to talk about future directions. Where do we go from here? What should we study next with regard to this topic? And you definitely, when you talk about future directions, where we should go next, you want to make sure that you talk about research needs to be done to address any of the weaknesses or gaps you mentioned in the previous section. So again, if there were no teenagers in the smoking cessation studies, you want to do more studies that involve teenagers. Okay, so that was the content of your paper. As far as formatting, again, you do want to use APA 7th edition formatting. That means you'll include a title page with a running head, an abstract, in-text citations and references. And again, your resources for this are the publication manual and also the Purdue Online Writing Lab has really good information about using APA formatting. And the final thing that you'll be graded on is your writing mechanics. So things like grammar, spelling, punctuation, and capitalization.